highly anticipated Final Fantasy XVI is almost here, and of course, it comes with a bit of cautious optimism, a bit of skepticism. There are a lot of changes coming to the Final Fantasy series. They have tried to show us trailers, gameplay previews. Those previews are getting a lot of praise, but we haven't gotten our hands on it yet. And admittedly, I have been skeptical of what Final Fantasy is offering. Is this going to be the Final Fantasy game for me? Is this going to be the Final Fantasy game for you? After playing the Final Fantasy XVI demo, I can admit my skepticism is put to bed. And not only is this looking like a Final Fantasy game that I will like, but Final Fantasy XVI is looking to be one of the biggest releases and best releases the franchise has seen in over a decade.
Stand back, Clive.
One of the biggest concerns for some fans of Final Fantasy XVI has of course been the following of recent trends in AAA games. And really, they're not shying away from that. It does have God of War cinematic battles. It does have Devil May Cry combat. And it is a very heavily influenced Game of Thrones story. However, I think after the demo, I am looking at this a bit differently. I was skeptical because I don't really like God of War as much as everyone else. I don't want Devil May Cry combat. I've never played it, and I'm not a big fan of Game of Thrones. But instead of just following these trends for the sake of it, I think Final Fantasy XVI does a great job of pulling the best of those and further enhancing the story in the game to make it feel like this was the way Final Fantasy stories were always meant to be told. It was abundantly clear in the opening 2 hours of the demo that this is still, in fact, a Final Fantasy game, just with a few different ways to tell the story. And speaking of the story, the demo is filled with numerous cutscenes that set the stage for Clive's journey. And it is packed with many twists, emotion, and of course, brilliant dialogue.
Father, why is it that the dominance is always born into our family? Doesn't seem fair.
We cannot live without the blessing of the crystals. And the crystals work their magic through us. You have been blessed, Joshua. Blessed to be a dominant, to wield the power of an icon.
The demo is a great tone setter. This is a mature story with graphic scenes, sex, betrayal, and it's all present in this demo. And Creative Business 3 has been critically acclaimed, obviously, of course, for its storytelling in Final Fantasy XIV. They clearly have a great understanding of how to do this, of how to tell these intricate stories, and Final Fantasy XVI looks to be no different. And the story sells itself. Final Fantasy has always delivered epic tales with high-end quality and production. That was an easy sell. The toughest sell was always going to be the combat system. This is a full-fledged action combat system. It's fast, it's flashy, and it's certainly not for every Final Fantasy fan, admittedly. Trying to fit games into genres almost seems now impossible with the lines being so blurred and games crossing over into many genres. And if I had to fit this one into a certain box, it most certainly wouldn't be the RPG one. This feels like an action-adventure game, at least from what we've seen so far. In the demo, there is almost no RPG elements to tinker with, and even if it does, I'm assuming it's going to be similar to a God of War or even Spider-Man. This isn't going to be, it feels like, a hardcore RPG game. This is an action-adventure game, and it does feel like it's kind of falling in line with other AAA games. But again, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. It's just different for Final Fantasy. And as far as combat goes, it's robust. It not only stands up to combat from other AAA games, as we've mentioned, but in a lot of ways, it's better. Final Fantasy XVI's combat it flows very well. It never feels like a string of combos is broken, and it really clicked with me during one battle in the iconic challenge, one of the portions of the demo. So I entered a room with about 6 or 7 enemies in it, and quickly started with a dash towards one, and immediately did one of the basic combos. Now there are 2 item abilities attached to each of the 3 icons. One seems like for crowd control, and the other for a powerful attack to break enemy guards. So, because I had a few enemies surrounding me, I used a swirling fire ability to damage those around me, dodged an oncoming magic attack, which, doing so precisely, leads to a precision strike and keeps the flow of combat moving. I was constantly comboing, dodging, switching abilities, and reading enemy movements to defeat enemies as quickly as possible. Now, I do recommend for the demo, they do have an item equipped called the Ring of Timely Focus. There are 4 of these rings that the players can equip that are essentially used to lower the difficulty of combat if the player chooses to. I didn't use 3 of them, but the demo does have the Ring of Timely Focus equipped to start. This slows down time before an evadable enemy attack, and the player will have to hit the command shown on the screen before the timer runs out. And at first, it did kind of feel like cheating a bit because it's not in the story portion of the demo, and then it just felt like they were kind of holding your hand a little bit, but I do think it is useful to start because combat can initially twist the player up because there are so many inputs that are being used during combat. Honestly, though, I think it's going to stay for me. There can be a lot happening on the screen, and it can sometimes be hard to see an enemy attack, and during the story portion of the demo, I got frustrated whenever I was attacked by an enemy I couldn't see on the screen. I'm sure there are going to be some people that will remove it for much more of a challenge, but I think for me, it made for a better experience, and some of the windows to evade those attacks are so tight that it never really felt like I was cheapening the combat. Then, in the final part of the iconic challenge, Final Fantasy XVI gets to a boss battle and, of course, leads to a lot of cinematic scenes during the battle, and Final Fantasy XVI absolutely nails this. They are seamless, and even though I'm not a fan of pressing a button during a cinematic battle, it really isn't that harmful to the gameplay experience. But what it does do is further drive home the most important aspect of Final Fantasy XVI. Its narrative. The best Final Fantasy stories are heralded as some of the best in gaming. Everything this game does, from its cutscenes, to its battle system, to its boss battles, everything it does is suited to tell this story in the best way possible. And while that means some changes that ultimately will turn away some fans, it's easy to see why Final Fantasy XVI decided to go this route. By the end of the demo, all the skepticism I had went away. And Final Fantasy XVI not only looks to be a great game coming out this year and a Game of the Year contender, but it is shaping up to be one of the best entries in the series ever, and especially one of the best stories this series has ever told.
Every man has his duty. Ours was decided long ago, when our ancestors chose to instate the dominant as the Archduke of Rosaria.